I'm looking to see if that's all. And it's not. Yeah, it is. I'm looking for the edges. This is Dr. Annette Feravich, and I am here. I want to close that door because I'm yelling number one, and then there is loud noise. Or sometimes a cool breeze, which feels pretty cool. I don't mean cool in that Fonzie way. I mean cool in that not hot way. It's a cool day here in Michigan in our reading room, and you know what? I don't know what I'm gonna read next if I get this all done, but I have 4 days to think about it, and I do owe this back to Plymouth Library. So yeah, we'll probably finish the book. We finished, you know where we finished. I was so sad. I was. Yeah, I'm sad. Sometimes I'm sad. Because I don't know who the characters all are. And I'm afraid that in the end, I'm very afraid of some things. Chapter 23, Afterlives and Legends. The sudden death of William Jennings Bryan shocked the nation. He had appeared to be in fine health. A story made the rounds that before he went to take that final afternoon nap, he told his wife he'd never felt better in his life and was eager to continue his fight for the primacy of the Bible. But his fight was over. Doctors in Dayton who examined Will concluded that he died of apoplexy. That is a stroke. Others, without the benefit of examining Will's body, came to a different conclusion. Clarence Darrow was unquestionably an immediate instrument in the early passing of the great commoner, wrote an Alabama journalist. It was a judgment shared by many angry at Clarence for his harsh and irreverent treatment of Will on the witness stand. The great commoner received a great statesman's honor. Flags in the nation's capital were lowered to half staff. President Calvin Coolidge sent a letter of condolence to Mary Bryan, praising her husband as a leader in the advocacy of many moral reforms, before setting off on a winding journey through the countryside between Dayton and Washington, D.C., where he would be buried. Will's body lay in a bronze coffin in the front room of the cottage where he died. Among the many local people who came to pay respects was John Scopes. The young professor bowed his head, a reporter noted, and gazed for a long time upon the grimly set features of the veteran crusader of fundamentalism. I just don't believe that. He's a crusader. The way they describe fundamentalism today and yesterday. Darrow, an instrument in sudden death of Bryan, says writer who saw clash. Commoners' rage over grilling he received on witness stand at Dayton probably was beginning of the end. Many people blame Clarence Darrow for William Jennings Bryan's death, as this front page headline from the Birmingham News of July 27, 1925 suggests. Making sure the volume's on. As a special funeral train made its way through Tennessee and Virginia, throngs of people came to the tracks to see off their hero at every station and along the route, wrote a journalist who rode the train. Men in shirt sleeves and overalls, women in gingham, and barefoot children have come to see the train pass and to gaze with bared heads and sorrowful faces at the last car on the train, where Bryan's casket rested. As the train rolled into Washington's Union Station rail yard, hundreds of railroad workers removed their hats in respect. People stood in line outside the church where Will's body lay in state for the chance to file past the open casket inside. 20,000 people got a final glimpse of his face. The U.S. Department of State closed down for a day to mark its former leader's death. Official death certificate of William Jennings Bryan. July what? I can't see that. It looks like it was July 26th. It is. 1925. So 100 years ago, the other day, last week, July 26th. When would that have been? Wait a second. I can figure it out. 26 and 10 minutes, so 5 days ago. Friday. 100 years ago, Friday. William Jennings Bryan passed. Oh my gosh, it's a little creepy, isn't it? There's the death certificate. Nellie Kenyon rode the funeral train to Washington, attended the church service, and described a scene that took place in Mary Bryan's hotel room after her husband had been laid to rest. The little gray-haired widow, as Nellie described her, gave a gift to a policeman from Chattanooga who had been an honor guard at the funeral. It is a sterling silver pen, Nellie wrote, the one the great commoner used to sign all important documents, and is the pen that placed his signature at the close of all communications written by him in connection with the Scopes evolution trial at Dayton. The policeman, choked up with emotion, said he would keep it always. Not everyone grieved. H.L. Mencken vilified Will. Hour by hour he grew more bitter, wrote the so-called sage of Baltimore. The hatred in the old man's eyes was not for the enemies of God. It was for the enemies of Bryan. The Bryan I shall remember is broken, furious, and infinitely pathetic, ridiculous, disgusting, deluded. Other critics made their points with less vitriol. I believe that God expects more of his children than to simply defend his great but much misunderstood book, the Bible, began the editorial writer for the California Eagle. And two, the question naturally arises where his brother Bryan has been. The 14th and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution were being grossly violated in every southern state in America, and especially his own adopted home state, Florida. It is not contrary to the teaching of the Bible to discriminate against, defranchise, and lynch American Negroes in the state of Florida and Tennessee. In contrast, the editorial continued, Clarence Darrow believes in the brotherhood of man first, not that man's face must be white in order to be entitled to that brotherhood, but because of his knowledge of evolution and the origin of man makes it plain to him that of one blood all men are created equal. This part of the Bible was too much for Mr. Bryan. The Eagle was a leading African-American owned newspaper. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most widely read black newspapers, editorialized in a similar vein. The life of Bryan was sincere, we think, from his point of view. His point of view, however, suffered a shocking change after he left Nebraska and went to Florida. He was a commoner in Nebraska. He became a militant disciple of color phobia, race discrimination, and religious bigotry after he settled in Florida. Negroes have nothing to treasure out of the life of Bryan. On Friday, July 31st, 1925, a funeral service for Will was held in a church just a few blocks from the building that he had 3 times tried to make his home, the White House. The event was by invitation only, but before the service started, 2 special microphones were installed inside. These microphones belonged to radio companies that would broadcast the service with its praise of God and of Will to people as far west as Minneapolis and north to parts of Canada. 3 years later, Will had enthusiastically embraced the newfangled technology of radio as the most wonderful of all the mysteries that man had unraveled. He spoke of the thrill of reaching what he called an invisible audience. At that time, it was late 1922. The New York Times estimated about 60 million people had already heard Will's voice. Now that voice was stilled. But thanks to that most wonderful of all the mysteries, an invisible audience numbering in the hundreds of thousands would be remembering William Jennings Bryan's voice and life in the hour before his body was lowered into the ground. And Will wasn't done with his audience. Bryan strikes from grave at evolution, announced the page 1 headline in the Atlantic American Statesman. Voice from dead backs Tennessee law, intoned the front page of the El Paso Herald. Bryan's supreme effort is given to the world. Speaks again, though lips are mute, declared North Carolina's Charlotte Observer. With such melodramatic headlines, the other, more sober, full text of Bryan's defense of Bible offered the Memphis commercial appeal. Newspapers around the country brought Will's final big speech to millions. On the witness stand, Will had been reduced to focusing on the supernatural aspects of Bible stories and on whether the earth was very, very old or fairly new. These were not the issues that over the years had won him so many followers. On the witness stand, Will hadn't emphasized the message of kindness and love through Christianity that had always been such a big part of his appeal. Lost in his responses to Clarence's interrogations was Will's concern for the moral and spiritual lives of ordinary people. Lost too was the banner he'd been waving ever since his 1896 run for the presidency, that the country's undemocratic elites, bankers, and business magnates in 1896, scientists and intellectuals in 1925, should not be allowed to impose their views and rules on the general populace. Here in the final message, Will came back to the ideals that people most admired. The speech was long, spilling over page after page of newsprint. Will would have needed a couple of hours to give it. Whether people read it in one sitting or over the course of days and evenings, they found it all the familiar and stirring notes that had been muted in the Rhea County Courthouse. Science is a magnificent material. Material force, he wrote, but it is not a teacher of morals. It can perfect machinery, but it adds no moral restraint to protect society from the misuse of the machine. Evolution, he asserted, would eliminate love and carry man back to a struggle of tooth and claw. It was a bloody, brutal doctrine that demanded, as the rabbi did 1900 years ago, that he be crucified. This was the vintage will. This was a far more fitting last word, a more fitting last 12,000 words to be precise, than his performance on the witness stand. He did not mention the name of John Thomas Scopes. Will did have quite a bit to say about Clarence Darrow in this final speech, particularly about Darrow's defense of the evolutionist and atheist Leopold and Loeb. For his part, Clarence kept his comments respectful in the wake of Will's death. Mr. Bryan was a man of very extraordinary powers as a speaker or a campaigner in any cause in which he believed, he said the day after Will died. I always considered him fairly honest. A few years later, in his autobiography, Clarence was less restrained. Mr. Bryan had made himself ridiculous during the trial, Clarence wrote, and had contradicted his own faith. I was truly sorry for Mr. Bryan, but not too sorry. I consoled myself, Clarence continued, by thinking of the years through which he had bruised himself, tormenting intelligent professors with impudent questions about their faith and seeking to arouse the ignoramuses and bigots to drive them out of their positions. 3 months after Dayton, Clarence was again in a courtroom defending a controversial cause. This time his clients were Dr. Ossian Sweet and his wife Gladys. The Sweets, who were black, had bought a house in a nice neighborhood in Detroit, a nice white neighborhood. A hostile white mob welcomed them to the neighborhood by attacking their home. The Sweets, who were inside with some of their friends, fought back with guns, and a white neighbor was killed. Prosecutors charged the Sweets with their companions with murder. Clarence's great challenge was to convince a jury that the ancient precept that a man's home is his castle, which excuses a person fighting back in self-defense against those who threaten his home, applied not only to white people but to black people as well. This was far from a sure thing, but he worked his magic on 2 different all-white juries. None of the defendants was convicted. The defense, said the Pittsburgh Courier, succeeded with matchless and brilliant oratory. The Sweet trial was Clarence's last great courtroom drama. He defended more accused murderers and saved some from execution. He wrote his autobiography and had speaking engagements. But a decade after Dayton, Clarence was unwell, plagued by heart disease. The once giant of a man shrunk to 90 pounds. On March 13, 1938, Clarence Darrow died at home in Chicago. He had almost lived to see his 81st birthday. Newspapers put Clarence's death on their front pages as they had Will's death, but the headlines for Clarence were not the double-decker extravaganzas that marked the great commoner's demise. By 1938, Clarence had been out of the public eye for a few years. Also, his death was eclipsed by a more earth-shattering event on that same day. Clarence Darrow died yesterday afternoon, his hometown newspaper reported under a modest headline. Once proud Austria died as a nation tonight, announced that same paper under a giant headline that took over the front page. Oh my God. You're liars if you don't see this coming. And not in this book. You're liars if you don't see this coming. You fucking assholes. Once proud, so Clarence Darrow died yesterday afternoon. His hometown newspaper reported under a modest headline. Once proud Austria died as a nation tonight. announced that same paper under a giant headline that took over the front page: Vienna hails Hitler today. Nazi Germany's takeover of Austria ushered in a new era, a war of unprecedented destruction, and the Holocaust. Clarence had lived long enough to witness and denounce Hitler's rise. No doubt he would have seen these developments in part as grotesque products of bigotry and intolerance. The same kind of bigotry and intolerance he showed William Jennings Bryan. No doubt William Jennings Bryan would have blamed the Nazis' genocidal obsession with racial purity on Darwinism gone wild. After his trial, John received requests to appear on vaudeville stages, talking about evolution, essentially to be a monkey trial sideshow. He wasn't interested. The expert witnesses at his trial had put together a scholarship fund for him to pursue graduate studies in any field he chose. He considered attending law school at his alma mater, the University of Kentucky, but when the dean, hoping to convince John to enroll, told him that he could become the next Clarence Darrow, that was the end of that idea. John's admiration for Clarence was boundless, but he didn't want to spend his life in a profession where he would always be compared to the great defender. So John turned to science, in particular to geology. During his 2 years studying at the University of Chicago, he and Clarence Darrow got together nearly every week. After he left school, John took a job with an oil company. A big draw of the job, it was in Venezuela, with forays into the jungles east of Lake Maracaibo. Here was one pocket of the world where he could hope that no one had heard of him. Later, John returned to the United States and continuing working as a geologist. He married and had 2 children. Once back in the States, John could not remain hidden. Students writing school papers tracked him down, news reporters, especially on the anniversaries of July trial, preachers waiting to show him the way to God. For the most part, John ignored them all, but they did not ignore him, and the trial did not fade from memory. Memory, though like genes, has a way of mutating. Memory can morph into myths. The myth-making started immediately at the trial's end. Mostly it was the glory of William Jennings Bryan. A genre of music emerged, Scope's songs. Will was barely buried with Columbia when Columbia Records released one by a popular country music singer, Vernon Dalhart, called William Jennings Bryan Last Fight. In a quavering tenor, Dalhart sang, "When the good folks had their troubles down in Dayton far away, Mr. Bryan went to help them, and he worked both night and day. There he fought for what was righteous, and the battle it was won. Then the Lord called him to heaven, for his work on earth was done." Another song made John out to be a sort of intellectual villain. "Oh, the folks of Tennessee are as faithful as can be, and they know the Bible teaches what is right. They believe in God above and his great undying love, and they know they are protected by his might. Then to Dayton came a man with his ideas new and grand, and he said, we came from monkeys long ago. But in teaching his belief, Mr. Scopes found only grief, for they would not let their old religion go. Then the folks throughout the land saw his house was built on sand, and they said, we will not listen anymore. So they told him he was wrong, and it wasn't very long till he found that he was turned from every door." So it's Edison record. Wow. How about that? And how about, I just read that book. That was the last book we read in Early Birds about Thomas Edison. I couldn't read it. A record of one of the Scope songs that became popular after William Jennings Bryan's death. So definitely, if you want a definition of conservative and hiding because they are hypocrites, it would definitely be, if you want a definition of progressives, or it would definitely be progressive. If you want a definition of conservatives that is historically sound with yesterday and today, it would be progressive. Well, thank God I don't know. You're hiding everything, you hypocrites. Not everyone agreed that the occasion called for myth and music. A month after the trial's end, the Crisis magazine, edited by the scholar and civil rights pioneer W.E.B. Du Bois, offered a sober reflection. This is so interesting how the blacks, I call them out, how the blacks are really supporting this scientific, the strength of this science. Wow. The truth is, we know it. The truth is, and we know it, Dayton, Tennessee is America, a great, ignorant, simple-minded land, curiously compounded by brutality, bigotry, religious faith, and demagoguery, and capable not simply of mistakes, but of persecution, lynching, murder, and idiotic blunder, as well as charity, missions, love, and hope. Dayton, Tennessee is no laughing matter. It is menace and warning. It is a challenge to religion, science, and democracy. And pay attention. It is. I mean, Du Bois is not wrong. He is not wrong. What blacks have said, they are not wrong. And I suppose, I guess I can't say that they're supporting science. Here it is again. The life of Bryan was sincere, we think, from his point of view. His point of view, however, suffered a shocking change after he left Nebraska and went to Florida. He was the commoner in Nebraska. He became a militant disciple of color phobia, race discrimination, and religious bigotry after he settled in Florida. Negroes have nothing to treasure out of the life of Bryan. I don't think he was right about the religious bigotry. I think, and also I don't think you're right about discrimination. I think you were correct about if you said racial prejudice. I think that would have been correct. I don't think he was discriminatory. That would have showed a behavior, and I don't think he did. I do think Darrow was discriminatory, though. I do. On the basis of religion. What did he call that? Religious bigotry. On the 10-year anniversary of the trial, Nellie Kenyon, who was still working as a journalist in Tennessee, went back to Dayton and asked a waitress at a local restaurant, what was this Scopes evolution trial about? Oh, it happened over there at the drugstore, the young woman replied. Bryan Darrow and a fellow named Scopes tried to claim we came from monkeys. They got into a big argument. Bryan got mad and got right up there in the drugstore and made a big speech. It was too much for him, so he went home that night and died. The trial, which rocked the world, Nellie wrote, had become a warped legend. Legend had it that Clarence killed Will with his words. What was it? A letter writer asked John that Darrow said to Bryan that killed him. Legend had it that Will utterly vanquished the evolutionist. He not only won his case in the judgment of the judge, in the judgment of the jurors, and the judgment of the Tennessee populace attending, wrote William Bell Riley, the fundamentalist leader who had recruited the great commoner in Dayton. He won it in the judgment of an intelligent world. Legend had it that Clarence conquered the fundamentalists. Theoretically, fundamentalism had won, for the law stood, wrote Frederick Lewis Allen in his best-selling book published in 1931. Yet really, fundamentalism had lost. Legislators might go on passing anti-evolution laws, but civilized opinion everywhere had regarded the Dayton trial with amazement and amusement, and the slow drift away from fundamentalism certainly continued. The legend of Clarence's moral victory over will and fundamentalism became entrenched in American lore when the play Inherit the Wind took the New York theater world by storm in 1955 and was made into a movie 5 years later. That was the movie I saw. I forgot what the name of it was midway through this book. And it's so good, but they do make him look like he ended up being ridiculed. And you forget, he was not claiming to be necessarily the expert on the Bible. He was an expert on what he knew, on his belief, which is what Darrow wanted to get to. Really, really good stuff. So, Inherit the Wind. Funny, poignant, absorbing, and frightening, Inherit the Wind told a story based on the Scopes trial, but it wasn't quite the story of the Scopes trial. I am so anxious. Look at that. I'm so anxious. Because, yeah, he was on the stand in the courtroom in that. Let's see. In the story, the character based on John Scopes is nabbed in his classroom, smack dab in the middle of a lesson on evolution, and thrown in jail. The writers took many liberties with the facts, but their most significant inventions were what they made of the people of Dayton and the character based on William Jennings Bryan. The Dayton fictionalized as Hillsborough, locals are strident, even dangerous religious fanatics. Will, his character is named Matthew Harrison Brady, is a bumbling fool, practically a clown. He calls evolution evolution. His pathetic performance on the witness stand in this fictional version turns even his supporters against him. In the end, the jury returns a guilty verdict against John, and the judge fines him $100, which is what happened in real life, and releases him from jail where he never was in real life. Matthew Harrison Brady is deprived of his chance to deliver his closing argument, again as in real life. But as the crowd is hurrying away from him, he is no longer their idol. He starts to make a speech anyway. Mid-sentence, he collapses and dies. The Clarence Darrow character soberly walks off into the future, carrying a Bible and Darwin's Origin of Species. Science, reasonableness, and tolerance and ending suggests have prevailed. So yes, exactly, because he walked away with the Bible as well, and so you were feeling like, oh, well, thank goodness, he was a believer anyway. No, that MFer wasn't. He wanted to make a fool of Will Bryan, and that was his only motive, and that is the motive of a true believer-hater. Don't be such believer-haters. Science, reasonableness, and tolerance, the ending suggests, have prevailed. The play, which ran from 1955 to 1957, became one of the longest-running dramas on Broadway. The 1960 film featured three major stars, Spencer Tracy, Frederick March, and Gene Kelly, and received 4 Academy Award nominations. There's no way to count up the number of people who have seen Inherit the Wind on stage or on screen, but for many audiences, it was the story of the Scopes trial. The film finally brought John Scopes out of the shadows. He hadn't gone to New York to see the play when it was on Broadway, but at the request of the movie's producer, John and his wife Mildred traveled back to Dayton for the premiere of Inherit the Wind on the 35th anniversary of the trial. Yeah, he kind of had this like fame thing. A Victory, chapter 24, which he didn't get. Mr. Chief Justice, may it please the court, the lawyer began, as lawyers do when they open their arguments before the Supreme Court of the United States. The courtroom fell silent. The 9 Supreme Court justices sat on their bench, eyes on the lawyer at the lectern in front of them. This case involves the constitutionality of the so-called monkey bill or the anti-evolution law, the lawyer continued in a pronounced Southern twang. The lawyer's client, the 20-something teacher at the center of the case, sat quietly behind him. The argument didn't last long, 11 minutes, hardly enough time for someone like Clarence Darrow, master of the 8-hour argument, to clear his throat. But the Supreme Court had strict limits on how long attorneys were permitted to argue before them. The state's lawyer, too, spoke briefly. He began in an unusual way, telling the justices that the case began under the administration of a previous state attorney general. What was the significance of that? Asked Justice William Brennan. The lawyer stumbled. I was just giving you background, Your Honor, he replied. I thought you were telling us your administration doesn't like the statute. Countered Justice Brennan. Laughter in the courtroom. No, the state's lawyer said. I'm not here prepared to say that. It might not be too late, quipped Justice Abe Fortas. The laughter got louder. Things didn't get much better for the state's attorney. By the end of the allotted time, he admitted to Justice Fortas that under the challenge law, teachers could instruct students in the Bible story of creation, but not in the theory of evolution. Justice Fortas wanted to make sure he got the statement right. In other words, he said, out of that whole area of the origin of man, the state had only prohibited a segment, that segment being the Darwin theory. Is that correct? That is correct. So ended the argument. The Supreme Court issued its decision less than a month later, a very quick turnaround. The anti-evolution law, it ruled, was in clear violation of the U.S. Constitution. The law's effort, wrote Justice Fortas in the court, was confined to an attempt to blot out a particular theory because of its supposed conflict with biblical account, literally read, but he explained, there is and can be no doubt that the First Amendment does not permit the state to require that teaching must be tailored to any religious sect or dogma. The law could not stand between it violated the First Amendment's prohibition of laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Victory for the teacher, victory for the evolutionist. For the first time ever, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a law that barred the teaching of Darwin's theory. Lucy, quiet. There's nobody there. Stop. Nobody there. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Good girl. No. Sit down. Good girl. Good girl. Susan Epperson, the Arkansas high school teacher who successfully challenged the state's anti-evolution law and the Supreme Court. It would be nice, and I fully agree, that we are arguing to the fullest extent. I happen to like William Jennings Bryan's arguments. I happen to like them. I don't think everybody does. I certainly back up the Supreme Court's decision right here. There she is. The young high school teacher at the center of the case was named Susan Epperson, not Judge John Scopes. The anti-evolution law in question was on the same statute books in Arkansas, not Tennessee. The winning lawyer who spoke so briefly before the Supreme Court was named Eugene, not Clarence. And the year was 1968, 3 decades after Clarence Darrow's death. And that headline, oh my God, that broke my effing heart. It did. There it is again. That's the only way you could take all this is by looking at a monkey. Who could take that? Oh! John's own case never made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. His lawyers did appeal to the Tennessee Supreme Court in Nashville. John declined to attend. He was done with the whole affair. He wasn't popular enough. The court's decision on the appeal showed that it was even more done with the monkey trial than John was. In 1927, the court upheld Tennessee's anti-evolution law, but it also reversed John's sentence. The reason the state justice said was that Judge Ralston had ruled on the amount of the fine, but Tennessee law gave that job to the jury. The jury, those 12 men who had been barred from witnessing a single dramatic episode in the trial, and also the high court now ruled from doing the job that Tennessee law specifically reserved for them. So John did not have to pay the $100 penalty. Also, the court said, with a touch of weariness, enough already. We see nothing to be gained by prolonging the life of this bizarre case, the justices wrote. Make it go away. They told the state of Tennessee. The next day, the state's attorney general did just that. He issued a legal notice that said, basically, this prosecution never happened. The state of Tennessee took back its charges against John. He heard about it when a reporter called him at home. John went on to live his life, dipping his toe in the anti-evolution pond when Inherit the Wind was released in theaters, and then again in January 1969. Susan Epperson had just won her case in the Supreme Court. She traveled to Shreveport, Louisiana, where John was living in retirement. They had lunch together at a Holiday Inn, two high school teachers from two generations who thought that teenagers could handle learning about evolution. I should not ever disparage John Scopes as being, obviously, he's not hungry for publicity. I should not have done that. John Thomas Scopes died a year later. He was 70 years old. Oh, you know what? Okay, no, we've got another chapter, and that's kind of young. John Scopes, 70, that's young. That's when my mom died. I shouldn't disparage my mom either. So we are going to pick this up, and I'll probably decide maybe over the weekend what our next book is going to be. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We have completed our 3 days on, and we will be going to our 4 days off. Hopefully you've been thinking about what you've been doing, or maybe you're more like me and you just let the spirit move you. I know what I'm going to be doing, though. I might actually finish that notebook. I gotta take a little breather because I'm so excited that I've gotten this far. But I have made a mistake. I have made a couple mistakes. I forgot what one of the mistakes was, but it doesn't really matter. They weren't big mistakes, because I said the other day, and look, no mistakes. There were, but I can't even remember what they were because it just looks so darn good. All right, so hopefully I'll be back here on Tuesday, and I've gotten all of the toxic energy boiled out of me. See, that's the whole thing. It sometimes has to boil out of you. That's true. That's a physiological fact. That's for darn sure. This is Dr. Annette Feravich here in the classroom on day 227. We just got through our last day of July here in Michigan. It cooled down, that is for sure. All right, thanks for joining me. Hope to see you back here on Tuesday.